The GM PD-4104 was never the fastest bus to roll down an American highway. It wasn't the most luxurious either, and by modern standards, it certainly wasn't high-tech. There were quieter coaches, bigger ones, flashier ones, and yet, here's the uncomfortable truth. No American bus was ever built again with the same philosophy. Not refined, not modernized, not even seriously attempted. That's the question that shouldn't exist. Why did a formula that proved itself mile after mile, decade after decade, end without a direct successor? Because this isn't really a story about one machine. It's a story about a moment in American history when the industry, the economy, and the culture all lined up just right and then quietly moved on. The 4104 didn't disappear because it failed. It disappeared because the world stopped rewarding that kind of right. In the early 1950s, General Motors wasn't just another bus manufacturer. GM was the American highway coach industry. At that moment in history, GM controlled nearly everything that mattered. The engines came from GM. The structural philosophy came from GM. The materials, the testing standards, the service expectations, those all came from GM as well. When an operator bought a GM coach, they weren't just buying a vehicle. They were buying into a system that had already decided what correct looked like. That's the part people forget. GM didn't simply sell buses. GM defined what a bus was supposed to be. The PD-4104 could exist because GM had things no other builder had at the same time: enormous capital, patience, and a long-term view that stretched decades into the future. GM could afford to design a coach that wasn't chasing the next contract or the next quarterly report. It could focus on balance, durability, serviceability, and consistency because it expected to support that design for years. Other manufacturers didn't have that luxury. They had to compete job by job, bid by bid. They had to tailor designs to specific buyers, specific routes, specific budgets. None of them could justify creating a single, unified national standard and then standing behind it with factory support coast to coast. That's why the 4104 wasn't really a competitive product. It was a technical statement. It was GM saying, "This is what a proper American highway coach should be." And for a brief window in time, the entire industry followed that definition, because no one else was in a position to argue with it. The PD-4104 didn't just come from the right company. It came from the right moment in engineering history, a narrow window that would never open again. By the early 1950s, diesel technology had finally matured. Engines were strong enough, durable enough, and predictable enough to rack up hundreds of thousands of miles without drama. But just as importantly, they were still free from the pressures that would come later. There were no modern emissions systems to package, no layers of electronics to manage, no federal noise standards reshaping how an engine bay had to be designed. What you built was what the driver touched and what the mechanic understood. That freedom shaped everything about the 4104. Its aluminum monocoque structure wasn't about style. It was about weight savings, rigidity, and fatigue resistance over long highway miles. No heavy body-on-frame compromises, no unnecessary mass. Just a structure designed to carry itself efficiently day after day. Mechanically, the bus was honest. Systems were straightforward. Components were accessible. A driver could feel what the coach was doing. A mechanic could diagnose problems without plugging in a computer or decoding warning lights. It was a machine you could live with, not one you had to negotiate with. Even the balance of size, weight, and power reflected restraint. The 4104 didn't chase higher horsepower numbers or bragging rights. It wasn't oversized or overbuilt. Everything was matched deliberately. Enough power to cruise American highways, enough structure to last, and nothing added just for the sake of it. The result was a coach optimized for what actually mattered: long-distance travel, high uptime, and long service life. That's the core truth. The 4104 worked because it was allowed to be simple. Later buses would be smarter, quieter, and cleaner, but they would never again be permitted this kind of mechanical clarity. And once that permission disappeared, so did the possibility of building another bus quite like it. The PD-4104 didn't just fit its technology, it fit its market. In the 1950s, intercity buses were still a primary way millions of Americans moved across the country. This was before mass air travel became routine, before flying was cheap, fast, and familiar. For many families, a long-distance trip meant a bus ticket, a suitcase, and hours rolling down two-lane highways. Operators judged coaches by one simple standard: how long they stayed on the road. The priorities were clear: years of service, minimal downtime, and the lowest possible cost over a long life. A bus that could run reliably season after season was more valuable than one that merely looked impressive on day one. Passengers were different then too. They were more patient. They accepted engine noise, vibration, and slower speeds as part of the experience. A bus ride wasn't an inconvenience to be endured, it was the journey itself. That culture mattered. The market didn't reward flash, novelty, or constant change. It rewarded machines that showed up every morning and kept going. The 4104 was born into that reality. It wasn't designed to impress, it was designed to last. And for a brief moment in American history, that was exactly what the industry wanted. If there is a single year that explains why a bus like the 4104 could never return, it's 1982. That was the moment deregulation fundamentally rewired the American intercity bus industry. Long-standing protections fell away. Competition intensified overnight. Routes that had once been stable became contested. Prices were pushed down, margins tightened, and survival started to depend less on durability and more on flexibility. In that new environment, the role of the bus itself changed. A coach was no longer viewed as a long-term asset meant to serve for 20 or 30 years. It became a shorter-term investment, something expected to earn its keep quickly and then be replaced when the numbers stopped working. The logic shifted from engineering endurance to financial efficiency. Operators began running the math differently. Purchase price mattered more than ever. Financing terms became central to buying decisions. Warranties, service contracts, and predictable costs started to outweigh the promise of extreme longevity. A bus that could last decades no longer made sense if the business model didn't. And with that shift came a new philosophy of procurement. Good enough became acceptable. Affordable became essential. The goal was no longer to own the toughest machine on the highway, but to manage a fleet that could adapt quickly to changing routes, schedules, and competitive pressures. That world had no room for a 4104-style coach. The 4104 was built for a system that valued stability, patience, and long horizons. It assumed operators would keep vehicles for decades, learn every bolt and bearing, and amortize quality over time. Deregulation shattered that assumption. Once the industry stopped rewarding longevity as a primary virtue, the entire logic behind the 4104 collapsed with it. Not because the design stopped working, but because the rules of the game had changed. From that point on, building another bus like the 4104 wasn't just unlikely. It no longer made business sense at all. The PD-4104 didn't outlive its maker, and once General Motors stepped away from the highway coach business, the entire formula went with it. GM had been more than a manufacturer. It was the standard setter. When GM exited, there was no longer a single pass to anyone else. It simply disappeared. Manufacturers like MCI, Prevost, and Eagle were, and still are, excellent builders. They understood operators. They built reliable, capable coaches. But they operated in a different reality. They responded to market demand rather than shaping it. Their designs followed contracts, regulations, and customer requests instead of establishing a single, unified vision for the entire industry. None of them could justify creating one coach to serve as a long-term national benchmark, and then committing to it for decades. The financial risk was too high. The market was too fragmented. The incentives were no longer there. The 4104 required something rare, a manufacturer large enough to control the entire ecosystem: engineering, production, parts, service, and long-term support, while being willing to prioritize consistency over constant reinvention. Once GM left, no one remained with both the scale and the motivation to sustain that kind of philosophy. That's the quiet truth behind the legend. The 4104 didn't die because it was outdated. It died because there was no longer anyone powerful enough or willing enough to keep its way of thinking alive. A modern highway bus is asked to be many things at once. It must meet increasingly strict emissions standards. It has to comply with ADA accessibility rules. It's expected to be quieter, smoother, safer, and filled with electronic systems that monitor, protect, and report everything from engine health to driver behavior. None of these demands are unreasonable. In isolation, each one makes sense. The problem is, what happens when they all stack together? Every added requirement brings more hardware, more wiring, more software, and more weight. Costs rise, complexity multiplies, and the simple reliability that once defined great coaches becomes harder to preserve. The goal quietly shifts from "this just works" to "this meets every requirement." The PD-4104 lived in a different world. It only had to do one thing well: run long distances, day after day, with minimal fuss. Its design wasn't pulled in a dozen directions at once. Everything served the same purpose: staying on the road. Today's industry no longer rewards that kind of absolute simplicity. It rewards compliance, adaptability, and features. And in that environment, a machine built around doing one thing perfectly, nothing more, nothing less, no longer fits. America didn't forget how to build a good bus. What changed was how value itself was measured and where resources were allowed to go. The PD-4104 didn't become obsolete in the technical sense. It wasn't surpassed because engineers lost their skill or ambition. It belonged to a different economy, one that rewarded long horizons, patience, and machines expected to serve for decades. It belonged to a culture that valued consistency over novelty and reliability over reinvention. That culture moved on. As the industry evolved, success stopped being defined by how long a coach could endure. It became defined by efficiency, compliance, flexibility, and financial return. Designs adapted to those priorities because they had to. The 4104 didn't fit that new math, not because it was wrong, but because it was too singular in its purpose. Some machines disappear because they fail. Others vanish because the world no longer needs that kind of perfection. The PD-4104 falls into the second category. It has no direct descendant, not because it left unfinished business, but because it finished its job completely. It carried America through a specific moment in its transportation history, and when that moment passed, the need for a bus like the 4104 passed with it. That's why it was never repeated.